Okay, I mentioned in the last lecture the Rig Veda, which is the most famous of the Vedas. Remember, Veda comes from the Sanskrit word for knowledge. They are the oldest of the Hindu scriptures that are available to us as a collection, the Rig Veda being one of several. Uh, I want to talk to you about a more recent development, still very, very old as far as we are concerned, as far as we see Hinduism. But the Upanishads were added many years after the Vedas and have actually become the most popular of all the Hindu scriptures, the most read. And part of that is because they serve as kind of a more modern summary of the teachings of the Veda. So you can read the Upanishads and get the basic idea of the Vedas, but there are also some updates and some changes in emphasis that you find in the Upanishads that were not true of the Vedas. The word Upanishad actually means sitting near. It has to do with the idea of sitting at the feet of a guru, a master, a teacher of Hinduism, and being educated by that person. It is also called the Vedanta, which is a word that means the end of the Vedas. Again, the Upanishads were added to, so they come at the end of the Vedas, and therefore they can be called either Upanishad or Vedanta. And they contain the most important truth summary of the Vedic tradition. In other words, if you don't want to read all the Vedas and dive into a huge collection, a huge quantity of Hindu scriptures, the Upanishads give you the essentials of what you really need in order to live a Hindu existence. And so, again, there are some nuances that are a little different, some changes, but you can consider yourself a faithful Hindu if you have limited yourself pretty much to the Upanishads. They consist of over 100 different works, sections, books. So it's quite a lengthy section. Most of these 100 are later works and are considered Smriti. Now, Smriti is a word that means remembered, and they're not considered to be the words of deity directly, the words coming from the gods, but they are considered to come from faithful teachers and therefore are worth remembering and observing. However, the oldest 13 of the Upanishads are called Shruti, and that's a word that means that which was heard, and the idea is heard from the gods themselves, and they are actually part of the original Vedas. And so you have two categories of Upanishads, those 13 that are considered to be the words of the gods themselves, and then the rest of them being words of famous teachers, even though they wouldn't have carry the same weight and authority as the 13 Shrutis. I know it all sounds confusing, and believe me, it is. I'm trying to summarize here a religion that is many, many years old, one of the oldest around, and give you the essence of what they believe. The Upanishads were written during the rise of Buddhism and Jainism. Now, we're going to see in a moment that Buddhism came out of Hinduism. Hinduism existed before Buddhism, and Buddhism sprouted from it. And so the Upanishads were actually written just as Buddhism and Jainism were coming about. We don't study Jainism here at the college in our religions class, non-Christian religions course. It's a fascinating religion. It's worth taking a look at, but it's not something that we delve into here. The Upanishads also made the Brahmanical ideas more accessible. And we'll talk about Brahman in just a moment, but two observations worth making here. The Upanishads talked about the idea of sacrificial rites. In the Vedas, the original older manuscripts of Hinduism, the emphasis was more on rituals, on sacrifice, on the rites that people performed in order to be faithful Hindus. But the Upanishads really shifted the emphasis more away from the outward rituals and toward inward meditation. So even the idea of yoga and, uh, uh, sitting in a position to meditate on deity and on the teachings of Hinduism really came about more through the Upanishads. So I would say that's probably one of the main differences between the Vedas and the Upanishads, the emphasis on the inward more than outward external rituals. And then 4 new concepts were developed in the Upanishads that some of them will probably ring a bell with some of you. Brahman is one idea, and Brahman, I'm just going to tell you, is a concept that's very difficult to explain. It's very difficult to understand, even for a Hindu. It's the idea of ultimate reality, of the ultimate essence of power and God in the universe. What makes it so complicated is that there are some who consider this Brahman to be a personal God, kind of like we would see the God Jehovah, the God of the Bible. Others would say, no, Brahman is impersonal. It's a power, a force that exists in the universe, but it's impersonal and unknowable, without attributes. And so it gets really, really confusing. But I guess the best way that I can explain it is saying that to some degree, it's the concept of an overarching, all-encompassing deity of some sort, whether personal or impersonal, that infiltrates and dominates the entirety of everything we know that exists. And if that sounds a little bit nebulous and complicated to you, that's because it is. And a practicing Hindu could probably describe it better than I can, but I've done some looking into it, and it's a very nebulous idea. Now, one thing that you need to understand is that out of this idea came the concept of 3 major deities in Hinduism, one being Brahma, and the other one being Vishnu, and then a third one called Shiva. And these became very popular major deities within Hinduism. Don't confuse them with the idea of a triune Godhead. We believe in one God that exists in 3 persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That is not the idea of these 3 major deities. They are 3 of the over 330 million gods estimated to be a part of the Hindu religion. Okay. Another major idea in Hinduism is what we call samsara. And this is where we get the idea of reincarnation. And the cycle of reincarnation was introduced in the Upanishads. Not that nobody believed that before, but it was at least developed more completely in the Upanishads. It's the idea that you live a life and you die, and then at some point you are reincarnated, you live another life, and as we mentioned earlier, the caste that you find yourself in the next life will depend upon how you did in the previous life. And the goal in Hinduism, simply stated, is to eventually be liberated from that wheel, that cycle of reincarnation or samsara. And that liberation would take you into the ultimate reality, the ultimate final, whatever it is that you enter into. Some refer to it as a certain nothingness that you actually become a part of. Very different from the concept of heaven that we teach as believers, because we believe that heaven is a literal place. It's described in certain terms in the scriptures. The Bible talks about the new heaven and new earth, where we'll exist for all of eternity. But the idea of liberation from the samsara cycle of reincarnation is very, very nebulous. And then the idea of the Atman was also introduced in the Upanishads, and that is the closest you can come in Hinduism to the idea of the soul. We talk about the soul, the immaterial part of man. That is kind of the idea with the Atman in Hinduism. Okay, the real you. In other words, when you are reincarnated in Hinduism, you come back with a different body, but your Atman remains the same. Okay? And so that's the real you that passes from life to life to life. And then there's the idea of karma, which most all of you have heard of. It's become a very popular term even in the Western world now. And karma is the idea of what you produce by doing good things or bad things. So you hear of good karma and bad karma. And the accumulation of your karma is what will determine the status in the next life that you assume, which caste you're part of and so on. And so these are four new concepts that came up in the Upanishads. Brahman, the ultimate, God idea that permeates the universe. Samsara, which is the idea of the reincarnation cycle that you try to get out of eventually by becoming illuminated. And then Atman, which is the idea of the permanent you that passes on from life to life in that cycle. And then karma, the doing of good or bad that determines where you end up in the next life. And of course, there's a biblical concept that sounds a lot like karma. Remember that Paul told the Galatians, don't be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. So the Bible does teach the concept of sowing and reaping, but not in terms of whether or not you'll be saved or what you'll be like in the next life. It has only to do with how we live as stewards of the life that God has given us now, and does not impact at all whether or not we're saved, because salvation is purely by the grace of God through our Lord Jesus Christ. All right. And then I'll end with this one. This is a picture of the god Vishnu. Now, Vishnu is depicted in a number of different ways. If you just type in any of the three major gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, you'll find all kinds of different depictions of what these gods may have looked like. But Vishnu is the most popular of those three main gods. And he is said to exist in 10 different emanations, okay? And different gods come out of him, if you will. And if you look at let me just make this a little bigger for you to see it. If you look at these 10 emanations of Lord Vishnu, you will probably recognize at least one and maybe a couple of them. If you look down at about 4 o'clock, you're looking at it like a clock, you'll see Buddha. And Buddhism actually comes out of the god Vishnu. And so when you talk about Buddhism, you have to remember that it originated as a part of Hinduism, and Buddha is one of those emanations. And then right above Buddha is Krishna, and probably is less likely that you've heard of Krishna, but he is probably the most popular god in the Upanishad scriptures in Hinduism. And there's a whole story about him. The Beatles, back in the 1960s, actually not the Beatles as a group, but one of the Beatles, after the group disbanded, actually wrote a song called My Sweet Lord, which is a tribute to Krishna, his god. Again, this is all extremely complex. And one of the things I want to say to you here just before we conclude Hinduism is that a lot of the religions in the two-thirds majority world, in the eastern part of the world, contain what Westerners would consider to be a lot of confusion and even contradictory ideas. But what you need to understand, and this is difficult for those of us who are Westerners, is that the idea of contradiction, or that which appears to be illogical, is not a problem in Eastern religions. Excuse me. And in fact, they would say that Westerners are a bit shallow in their approach to things because we limit ourselves to what is logically explicable. In fact, one person made the statement that Westerners are under the tyranny of logic. They consider themselves free from the bonds of logic, and so if something appears to be be contradictory or illogical, they're okay with that because it only illustrates for them the depth and complexity and richness of their religion. There's a whole lot to that, but I just want you to be aware that that's the way they would view that. So if you try to argue with a Hindu or a Buddhist, on the basis of what is logical or non-contradictory, you probably are going to have a hard time getting somewhere with that. It's only the Spirit of God that can really bring them to a place where they understand the truth as the true God has revealed it to us.